In 1937, Dale Carnegie wrote what is now his watershed book entitled How to Win Friends and Influence People. Many of you have probably read it. In the decades since that book was first published, it's gone through a number of reprints and copyright renewals in subsequent years, and to this day it ranks as one of the most translated, printed, and read books in the world. As Mr. Carnegie wrote in the introduction of his book, he said that he wrote it in part as a response to looking for and not finding a practical working handbook on human relations. He spent years teaching educational courses, various places. Back in the day, it was YMCAs and other public places where he would teach public speaking, and encouraging those that were partaking of these classes to use their own personal experiences and teaching them how to think on their feet, express their ideas with clarity and poise and so forth. But the more he taught his public speaking course, the more he realized what the individuals really needed was some practical understanding of how to deal with relationships, even more than the public speaking, the everyday interaction. And so what he discovered was that there was no handbook written that would walk an individual through how to understand and get along with people. There actually is. We'll get to that in a moment. But what he began to do then was collect information along this line for a course. And the way he went about it was reading any book, magazine article, or such that touched on this topic in terms of relationships. He read biographies of successful men, world leaders, people of renown, and he began to incorporate this in his presentation, his course. He studied as well the works of philosophers and psychologists and interviewed scores and scores of successful people. And he initially shared this information in the form of what he called rules that he printed up on index cards. And this became his presentation, but as he would give this presentation, people would ask him to buy copies of his cards so that they could continue going through the material and internalizing it. Well, from his cards, this grew into a larger set of cards, and then because people were requesting these cards, he began to develop small booklets, and finally he decided just to write a book that had all this material in it, which is how that all came to be. The book that I was referring to that actually does exist that speaks to this matter is, of course, the Bible. It's a sad note that the Bible's not seen in this regard. Usually people think of it as a list of do's and don'ts and God, religion controlling people and things of this nature that we have in a modern cultural context. But one of Mr. Carnegie's points was how to have a deep relationship. One of the keys was to have a genuine interest in the other person. What he meant by that was to truly listen to them with the intent to help them. So let's look at Proverbs 18 and see that this is actually a spiritual principle. In Proverbs 18 and in verse 24, Solomon writes here, he says, "A man who has friends must himself be friendly." We have to show an interest, right? We have to show that we're listening, that we care, that we're pondering what's being said. And then to finish the verse, it says that there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. We'll come back to that point here as we progress. But this is just one way of what the Bible discusses in terms of these relationships that we're to have. But in looking at the second part of this verse, the ending part, there's some deeper, I think, understanding that we can come to looking at some other translations. So, for instance, in the contemporary English version, the last part of that verse, there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. In the contemporary English version, it says, "Some friends don't help, but a true friend is closer than your own family." In the New Revised Standard Version, it says, "Some friends play at friendship, but a true friend sticks closer than one's nearest kin." And again, the Proverbs in general are great relationship advice, how to deal with conflict, how to deal with anger, how to deal with relationships in general. But additionally, the Bible is a book of history. It has a book of teachings in it, if you will. We learn doctrine from what God has recorded for us in Scripture. It's also a book of prophecy. But as I mentioned a moment ago, in my estimation, at its core, it's primarily a book about relationships. Within ourselves, within the interactions we have physically, but certainly our relationship with God. It can be easy for us to humanly fill our lives with things, to be worried about these physical things, whether it's a better car or different clothes or the latest electronics or whatever other things are around us. But those are not the things of lasting value, are they? The cars get old, they get dented, they wear out, they have to be replaced. Clothes the same way, all these things. I got my first computer. It had 8 megs of memory. And that everybody thought that was huge at the time. You need at least 8 megs of RAM now to run a simple computer, let alone terabytes of storage. But anyway, we get caught up in the social context aspects of some of this technology around us. We think those involve relationships, not to pick on people in particular, but, I always find it interesting why people think I'm interested in what they have for dinner when they post pictures on Facebook. But yet people do this all the time, don't they? Why else does it hurt so much? Talk about relationships. Why does it hurt so much when we're made fun of, whether it's at school or work or even family members? Why can it be hard for us to stand up for our beliefs before the world? It's a very uncomfortable place to be sometimes, depending on the conversation or lack of it being had. But for better or worse, human beings cling to those relationships. We are relationship-driven creatures. And if we stop to consider what leads to a healthy and balanced relationship, then we can have a much better life. So that's what we're going to consider today, but more specifically, relationships as God intends them to be. So let me begin by asking a question. Do we even need relationships? In spite of what I've all said, there are some people that say, well, I'll just go off and live by myself. And there are people that can do that. But for the most part, we still crave these relationships. In many ways, it would be easy. Life would be very easy if we could just go off and be by ourselves sometimes. I say, my job would be really easy if I didn't have to deal with people. But that's the job, isn't it? But let me tell you a sad story about relationships and how some of this works. There was an emperor of the Roman Empire. His name was Emperor Frederick II. He reigned from around 1220 to about 1250. And he ruled over Italy. At the time, included Sicily, parts of France and Germany, and other areas of Europe. But he was known to be a very capable and intellectual ruler. But he could also have a very cruel side to himself. And part of this cruelty extended to some experiments he would do on people. And one such experiment he did was on children. He wanted to know what man's original language was. As an intellectual pursuit, what would people normally speak? What was the original language? So his reasoning was that if children were not spoken to in their infancy, they would speak what was naturally inclined. So whether this would be a known language like Hebrew or Greek or French, or whether it would be something else. So he reasoned again that they would naturally speak whatever the natural tongue of men were. So the wet nurses that were assigned to take care of these children were sworn to silence. They could not interact with these children in any form in terms of speech. They would take care of all their needs. They would feed them. They would change their diapers. They would take care of all these different things. But the infants never heard a word or a sound from a human voice. And within several months, they all died from lack of human interaction. We need this interaction with others. For some people, it might be a lot. For some people, it might be very little. But we still need it to various degrees. So the key then is figuring out how that interaction should take place. So it's beneficial, as even Mr. Carnegie realized, so that it's beneficial for all. So what does Scripture have to say about some of this? Well, let's go back to Exodus 20, and let's look at the Ten Commandments in brief. I can almost guarantee you that if anybody is familiar with the Ten Commandments and you ask them if they're about relationships, their answer would probably be no. Because again, they see it as a list of things we can't do, restrictions, prohibitions. But when you look at the intent of what God is laying out here, the Ten Commandments are rules of relationships, and they're broken into 2 parts. So the first 4 commandments, as you look at them here, would be how we are to interact with God. what the parameters are, what he would value, and what we then gain also by interacting with him this way. And then the last 6 are how we do with interpersonal relationships, our fathers, our neighbors, and so forth. So just to highlight some of it, in verse 12, this begins the latter 6. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the eternal your God is giving you. So your relationship with your parents. You shall not murder. That's the greater cultural context, isn't it? Because it breaks down. How do you know that you're safe? How do you know that your life is not going to be taken from you? You shall not commit adultery. This is relationships between individuals, a relationship that is intended with only one. You shall not steal. I mean, think of any of these commandments, especially the last 6, and how different the world would be if it just kept one completely, just one completely. So like stealing, you wouldn't have any locks. I'm not looking for a show of hands or a shout out, but how many keys do you have for everything? Everything has a key almost. You have to lock everything up. Verse 16, you shall not bear false witness, to lie. Trust is broken when we're lied to, isn't it? And it's very hard to gain back. And then not to covet, which ultimately can lead to either murder or adultery or stealing or some of these things. To just be content with what we have. So in simple terms, these commandments are talking about these relationships and how they work and what benefits us. But it can come down to some simple things, and in 2 things specifically. It comes down to humility, and it comes down to putting the other person first. So under humility, you can find these lists online. There are 6 words that express this humility. One of which is, I admit I made a mistake. If we want to put it in simpler terms, it would simply be, I was wrong. How hard is that for people to say? It's probably one of the most difficult things to say. The other way to express this humility is talk in language of we, not you, right? We. So then the second one of putting the other person first, this is what Dale Carnegie recognized, and this is what the Bible talks about, and it usually talks about this in terms of love and serving others. And so think about how these can be expressed. In 5 words, something as simple as you did a good job. It's really interesting that those that have studied workplace environments, and especially as you look at them currently, it's an environment that's very much in flux. Right? Before COVID, very, very few people worked what we call remote. But during COVID, almost everybody did, unless you were a nurse or a policeman or something like this. And then COVID ends, and all these companies are now saying, well, we want you back in the office. It's like, well, why? Right? I can do the job remotely, and I have to deal with traffic, and I have to deal with a clothing expense and a meal expense, and all these stressors, and I can take care, my kids can still be here, and I can still do my job. And yet, how many have clamped down on that? And so what many have done in looking at this is, oftentimes it's not about money. It's about the things that make them feel valued in the jobs. Think about you in your life. How many times somebody has said, you did a good job, and how that makes you feel. Another way to express this in 4 words is, what do you think? Right? The other person now has opportunity to engage. And it's not this one-sided conversation. The politeness in the culture, after you please, or simply saying thank you. Even marriage counselors have come to see this, that one of the primary indicators of whether a marriage will last long-term or not is how kind they are in the marriage. Saying please and thank you. Does a tremendous amount of goodwill. So let's look at some categories here as we continue. We'll start with relationship with God. As we looked at here in Exodus, any relationship has parameters, right? We'll call them boundaries. We kind of use that language today. You have to define what the boundaries are. What is acceptable? There are times I might have a phone call with somebody and I'll say, don't talk to me that way. If you want to have a conversation, we can have a conversation, but I'm not going to deal with the volume. I'm not going to deal with the accusations, or I'm not going to deal with the cussing. If you do, I'll hang up on you. And I have a few times I've hung up on people to just impress upon them that is a boundary that I have. Okay, it's okay to have these boundaries as long as it's understood. But our relationship with God is no different. We have boundaries, don't we? He says, don't go after other gods. In many ways, that's no different than the commandment that says, don't commit adultery. He says, you're mine. I don't want you doing these things. How you honor me in terms of language, making his name holy, in terms of remembering the day he sets aside, the Sabbath day. For us to have this relationship, God then expects us to behave in certain ways, and in return, he'll behave certain ways to us. And what is missed even in Christianity, but in the world as a whole, is that God returns way more than what we give to him. Whether it's tithing, whether it's worshiping on the Sabbath, whether it's any of these other things that he says, this is how I expect you to behave. He blesses us beyond those things. So, considering this then, is God your best friend? Do you consider him a best friend? Do you see him as a friend? Most people probably don't even see him as a friend. They see it as a transactional relationship, or they see it as an obligation. But how much does God give to us? You know, every morning we wake up on the warm side of dirt, right? We have air to breathe. Most of us have food to eat. We have clothing. We have shelter. We have the basic necessities of life. But we tend to take that for granted, don't we? I know as I get older, I've taken my body for granted way too long. So now when I get injured, it doesn't go away just like that, right? You fall. I fell a couple of weeks ago, and this palm still hurts. I can't grip the way I used to. It'll probably come back, but it may be a while. But God gives us so much. But also think about, how does God serve you? Do you even think about God serving you? But he gives us everything, doesn't he? In serving us, he also sent his son to serve us. What he provides for us, the blessings and the opportunities. And what does he ask for in return? Well, let's go to Mark chapter 12. Unfortunately, most of the world, and as I said, even unfortunately some in Christianity as a whole, they don't see God in this way. But he's not asking for the world back. He's asking for what he knows works, to see us blessed, so that we may be blessed. So in Mark 12, in verse 28, a scribe comes to him, one of the scribes. The scribes were the individuals within the Levitical line primarily, whose task it was to make copies of Scripture. And so because they spent day in, day out doing this, there's no printing press, right? So they have to literally write every copy out by hand. Because they spent so much time doing that, they became very familiar with the instruction. And so they're also called lawyers in the Gospels, especially. So this is somebody who understood Scripture. He comes and he has this conversation with Christ. He hears them reasoning, and he perceives that Christ has answered them well. And so he asks Christ, which is the first commandment of all? Which is the biggest thing? What's the number one point? That's what he's asking. So Jesus answers him, but as he often did, he doesn't answer him the way this man expects. He actually gives him two answers, right? The first one is, in verse 29, first of all commandments is this: Hear, O Israel, the eternal your God, the Lord is one. That's Deuteronomy 6, right? That's what the Jews call the Shema. That's the very first thing. He says, and you shall love the eternal your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, with all your strength. So he's elaborating on that statement, which is essentially then a summarization of the first four commandments, isn't it? Right? Loving God with all of your being. So then in verse 31, he gives him the second part. So he said, you didn't ask, but I'll give you another one. The second greatest commandment is like it. He said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There's no other commandment greater than these. And that statement is the summarization then of the other six, isn't it? Loving our neighbor as ourself. And so this is what God expects. First and foremost, he wants a relationship with us. And he wants us to have the proper relationship with each other and with him. So let's transition then and look at probably the next greatest relationship that we can have humanly, and that is within marriage. So let's go back a few chapters here in Mark to chapter 10. Christ was asked on a couple of occasions about marriage, various aspects of marriage. And part of it was because of the nature of things over time, and it's even reflected in our modern culture. Marriage was not seen as a lifelong commitment the way it needed to be seen. And so in verse 6, to kind of break into the thought here, he goes back in answering the question about this. Why did Moses allow these certificates of divorce? So he says, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. So he goes back to what was initially established. What did God intend? A man and a woman, one each, committing in marriage to be for life. So in verse 7, he says, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one. So this is not just speaking of the sexual union. This is in every regard, right? Decisions you make, how you think, what you value, what your goals and plans are, how you raise children, just all of these things. You begin to think like one. And this is a beautiful thing. When couple's been married long enough and you see this, right? One can say to the other, what was that thing that day? And they know exactly what you're talking about. No one else understands. It's like, how did you get that? It's like, well, they know how they think, right? But this oneness in all these areas, because as he says here, what God has joined together, let not man separate, because the two becoming one is bigger than the ones individually. Right? You have someone to support you. You have someone to correct you. A spouse can correct you a way no one else can. Right? Because you have that relationship with them. If a person on the street stops you and tries to correct you, you're not going to take it very well, are you? Who is this guy? What is he doing? But a spouse can say, honey, come on. You're being stupid. This is not the way to do this. Whatever. And we understand where they're coming from. But let's go to Ephesians. Ephesians chapter 5. Paul had to address this as well, because even in the Gentile world, they didn't understand the reason for marriage, and even today. You ask most people why they get married, they're probably going to give you all kinds of answers beyond what we're going to find here. Right? We were in love, it seemed reasonable, we had the same goals, just all these kind of different things, which are not bad things, but God intends something different in this relationship. So in Ephesians 5 and verse 20, he starts out by saying that we're to give thanks for everything that God gives us. And then verse 21, that we're to submit to one another. This is talking about the marriage relationship specifically here, to submit to one another in that marriage relationship. Because going back to Genesis, right, Eve was to be the comparable or compatible helper. But that should also go both ways, right? Because if Adam needed to be more complete, if you will, in that regard, then certainly Eve would as well, because she came from Adam. So then to continue, he starts talking here to the wives, saying, wives, submit to your own husbands. Notice how? As to the Lord. Which means if they're not behaving as the Lord, you need to have a conversation. Right? Because they shouldn't be behaving that way. But he says, continuing the thought, the husband is the head of the wife, as also Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body, which means the husband should act that way as well, to serve the family, the wife especially. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, let wives be to their own husbands in everything. And then he comes to the husbands in verse 25, husbands, love your wives. Why did he say that? Because men forget to say it. We forget to show it. We get busy taking care of things. We get focused on tasks. But to love them specifically the way they need to be loved. Whatever that means for that wife, that woman. Just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. What did Christ hold back for us to be part of the church? There's nothing he's held back, to the point of giving his life. The sacrifice that he made, his whole physical life, to be that perfect sacrifice. The value, the attention, the commitment it took for all of that, the desire to even be the sacrifice. Because as he did this, it says that he might sanctify and cleanse her by the washing of water by the word. husbands, do we consider this in this relationship, that our actions help to sanctify and cleanse our wives before God? That puts a whole different perspective on the relationship, doesn't it? So then he says that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their wives, notice, as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. That's a deep relationship, isn't it? There's a lot of value and a lot of respect and a lot of care and love that goes behind that. So then he explains this, going back in verse 31 to Genesis, going back to what God intended, that these should become one flesh. We read that just a moment ago as well. And then verse 32, he says, this is a great mystery. To the world, marriage is a mystery. Why do we desire this relationship so much? I mean, every culture in the world has some form of marriage. It's because this is what God intended. This is the way he designed us, to be committed in these relationships. But he says, I speak concerning Christ and the church. That's the other thing the world doesn't see, is the spiritual side of the relationship, of what that marriage is to reflect. It's supposed to reflect our relationship with Christ. And so then he says, nevertheless, let each one of you particularly love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. And those are the critical elements. Women crave to know they're loved. Men crave to know they're respected. So you can write in your notes as well, 1 Peter 3, in the first 7 verses or so, where Paul discusses dwelling with knowledge, with understanding. Because men don't think like women. Women don't think like men. And that's probably a good thing, because if we all thought the same way, we'd be irritated with each other. Nothing new would be done, would it? So let's move from that then. What ideally comes out of that relationship then is this relationship with family. Because when we're born into that relationship, aren't we? We're born into a family. And it is in family that we have the most exposure to these interpersonal relationships and seeing how the relationship with God is modeled, how it's supposed to work. Because it's in the family relationship that we should see this love expressed and the practical aspects of relationships. As we just read here in Ephesians, then, when a husband demonstrates this godly love, then the whole family benefits, doesn't it? When the wife serves in the marriage in her role, it benefits the whole relationship. When the husband does his responsibilities and the wife and the children feel secure, they feel loved. And there's study after study after study that's done that shows children raised in a stable, biological, two-parent family household do so much better in almost every metric out there. They have lower rates of alcoholism and drug abuse and violence and sex outside the right relationship and all these things. And so this is part of the benefit. When men know that they're respected, they will give all of themselves to serving the family. So husbands have a role, wives have a role. The children learn, ideally, what those roles look like and how they should emulate it. But to go back here in Ephesians to verse 21 to stress this point, a matter of submitting to one another. You know, the strengths that can be had in a relationship. Maybe the wife is better at one thing than the husband. Can the husband be okay with that? There are things that I love that Roxanne takes care of because I don't even have to think about them. Right? I know they will be taken care of. And likewise the other way around. And that's the value, part of the value of that as well. But let's go back and just read Genesis 2 and look at what has been quoted and alluded to a number of times as God established that first married relationship. In Genesis 2 and in verse 18, God says to himself, "It's not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him." Right? Women have the same intellectual capacity. They have the same ability to love and serve and do all these things. But women don't have the physical strength men have. They don't have the same body in terms of even hormones. Medical science is late coming to the table with these sort of things, but even addressing diseases, women's and men's bodies are different. Medicines behave differently. But God says it's not good that Adam's by himself here, mankind in general, men in general. So he says in verse 19, out of the ground, then God took and formed every beast of the field and bird and brought them to Adam. I always found this interesting. It shows the intellect of Adam, that he could name every one of them, give them a name. And maybe it was based on features, behavior, I don't know. But I think part of why God did this was to show Adam, there's no one else like you. Right? And so after he goes through this exercise, then God puts a deep sleep, verse 21, to Adam, takes one of his ribs, and that's a very interesting thing as well. The rib is one of the few bones in the body that you can take and use in other parts of the body to model other bone. And so he takes this rib and basically makes a clone of Adam, but different. Right? He creates a woman. But he did it deliberately as well from the rib so that they see that it's from his side, somebody next to him. Not under him, not over him, not the foot, not the head, sort of thing. And so then Adam says in verse 23, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This is someone like me. This is someone, not an animal, that I can have this relationship with. And so he says, flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. And theologians have argued over the meaning of the word used there for woman, but one of the possibilities here is that the etymology speaks to a man with a womb, right? Human, very similar, but different in this regard. So then we read what we've alluded to in verse 24. A man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. They shall become one flesh, united as one. So then let's look at the last relationship we'll consider here today, and that is these relationships with friends then that we're to have. Let's go to Amos chapter 3. Can you have, I hope this is rhetorical to you, can you have a relationship with someone who is arrogant? It's almost impossible to, because it's all about them, isn't it? They don't want to hear about your day. They don't want to hear your thoughts. They don't want to hear if you don't agree with them. It's all about them. You might have a working relationship, but you're not going to have any kind of deep relationship, are you? In fact, in most cases, we probably tend to avoid those people because they're just draining, right? They want to dominate everything about the conversation and the environment. But a humble person, going back to what we discussed much earlier here, will allow this give and take. You're working on something. Well, come take a look at this. Here's what I've done. Here's what I'm thinking. And they'll say, well, what if you do this? Or what if you do that? And it's like, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I like that idea. Or no, I did consider that. But you have this give and take, right? You have this relationship here. Humility is then the opposite of pride and arrogance. But as I mentioned earlier, humility is absolutely essential in godly relationships to allow for this give and take. And we see this in Amos chapter 3 here, specifically verse 3. Can two walk together unless they are agreed? Now, some will say, well, this is not talking about relationships in this context, but I would argue that it is, because what is God saying through Amos here? He's talking to the nation because they've drifted. They left the instruction of the commandments. They had followed other gods. They were worshiping these gods in awful practices. Immorality was rampant. The relationships were breaking down. The nation was breaking down. And they think everything's okay. Sort of a Pollyanna head in the sand approach. And God is putting a point to it here. Can two walk together unless they are agreed? The answer is no. We don't walk together with people we don't agree with. Depending on the level of disagreement, we avoid them. We don't want to have the conversations with them. Well, think about that in any relationship you have, whether it's with God, whether it's with a spouse, if you're married, with your children, if you're in a family, with your parents, or any relationship that you have at school, at work, or wherever. To be in agreement is an amazing thing because you create a synergy, right? You don't just add 1 + 1, you get 2. You add 1 + 1, you get 4, because you can divide the responsibilities and you can focus and you can generate so much more out of it because you're sharing the load. Let's go to Ecclesiastes chapter 4 next. Solomon was given probably the biggest leg up anybody could ever ask for. Right? God had told David wanted to build a temple to God, and God says, I like that idea, but I can't have you do it. He's just too violent a background. But I'll let your son do it. So David collects all the material. Solomon becomes king. He creates this temple out of what David had set aside, and they go to dedicate it, and Solomon asks the prayer before God, and God essentially says to him, okay, what do you want from me? What can I do for you? I mean, that's a blank check, isn't it? If God said that to you, what would you ask for? He could have asked for wealth. He could have asked for power. He could have asked for all kinds of things. And he asked for wisdom, which is the best thing he could ask for. He said, I don't know from going in and coming out. I don't know how to lead these people. I need you to show me. I need you to give me that. And God says, okay, because you asked for that, which is the greatest thing to ask for, I'll give you everything else. But he went down a bad path, didn't he? Wives and military power and just all these other things, and he got so distracted. I read the book of Ecclesiastes as a book of an old man looking back on his life with regret, because he had an opportunity to have it all, and he didn't, because he focused on the wrong things. So in Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 9, he talks about these relationships. He says, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their labor. Right? Again, you can divide responsibilities, whatever it is you're trying to take care of. One person can be focused on the main task, and the other person can be supporting. This is just a safety thing, right? You're doing anything that might involve any kind of danger or just even sort of safety stuff. It's always better to have somebody there, isn't it? You think you can work on the power without turning it off, and maybe you get shocked and your fingers lock up. It's nice to have somebody to push you off that. When I've given this sermon previously last week in Dells and Oshkosh, I related a story of a fellow I knew in New England. He died a number of years ago before we came to Wisconsin, but he was a true Yankee in the sense he owned a couple of 100 acres up in Maine. He logged part of it. Part of it had enough gravel on it. He had a gravel pit that he would sell gravel out of every so often. He had a shingle business with making cedar shingles. He was a gunsmith. He could make a gun from nothing, create a whole gun. So he was just one of these kind of guys. Well, oftentimes when he would go cut wood, he'd go cut it by himself. And trees being trees, sometimes they do weird things when you cut them. Depending on the compression or the tension or just all kinds of variables, they can do funny things when you release all that. And one day one did. He was cutting down a big enough tree. When he cut it, it bucked back funny, and it ended up pinning him on the ground. Fell on him, broke his hip. So he's under this tree with a broken hip in the middle of the woods. Nobody knows where he is. What do you do? Well, he laid there long enough to gain some strength back, past the shock of everything, what had happened. He finally dug himself out underneath the tree with a broken hip, and then he crawls out of the woods with a broken hip until he could get close enough to the house that yelling got the attention of the family and they could come help him. He didn't have anybody with him. He probably would have wished that he'd had somebody with him, or at least a cell phone or something to call somebody when he fell down, but that was before that technology as well. 2 are better than 1. And even think about our relationship that we have with each other here at church. The biggest reason we're here is because God commands us to be, right? But is it just because God commands us to be? Going back to Ephesians 5, what are we learning in relationships? This is about relationships as well, isn't it? Because I can almost guarantee you, everybody in this room, even people that will watch this video later or whatever, we probably wouldn't know each other at all if God had not called us. We live in different spots of this, even just this area, right? We probably would have never crossed paths, never interacted, and yet we're a family here. God is asking us to develop these relationships because we're part of his family, and we will be for eternity. To consider this then, to continue on, he says in verse 10, for if one falls, the other will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls. Again, part of the value of being here is so we have these conversations. We know what people are dealing with, the good and the bad and the frustrating. How's the job going? Well, I got fired this week. And even if you can't do anything about it, just to have a sympathetic ear. Well, what's going on? What are you thinking? And just let them process. Or even if it's something innocuous, you can share the joys and triumphs. He says, verse 11, again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. Right? You remember the account when David was a very old man, he was dying. I like the way the King James says it. It says he gat no heat. So they bring in Abishag to lay next to him. And I always found that very interesting as well, because Solomon probably picked up a lot of what he went through from his father. David had a number of wives, and I think that was part of a test to see what David would do. But mostly his advisors did it because David was freezing. His body wasn't generating enough heat. And it's just simple practicality that we can take care of one another in various ways. Verse 12 then, though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him. And so think of us in our relationships, to be able to pray for people, to be able to intercede for each other. Sometimes we can say, somebody says, well, I had this happen this week. And you might be able to say, well, I can help with that. You need help with that? Whatever that is. Or I know somebody that can help you. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. As you make a rope, the more strands you have in it, typically the stronger it is, the more weight it can carry, the stress it can take. Think of us. We sing the hymn about being woven together. Do we really think about that in the relationships we have? Let's go then to Titus chapter 2. In Paul's instruction to Timothy and Titus, he was trying to help them as young pastors understand some of the perspectives and approaches they needed to have in leading God's people. Even though you may not be a pastor, an elder, or somebody in those responsibilities, the relationships still stand, the principles. So in Titus 2 and in verse 1, Paul is talking to Titus here about qualities within a sound church. What makes up a healthy spiritual family? So he says, it's proper that you speak sound doctrine. You have to start with God's truth. If it's not based on God's truth, the foundation's bad, the building's going to be bad. So he says, start there. The older men then be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith and love and patience. That the older men should be these examples. Right? They've lived long enough. You should have some wisdom. How do you gain wisdom? From good decisions, right? How do you learn how to make good decisions? By making bad decisions. You should learn from what you go through. Okay, I don't want to do that anymore. That didn't go very well. So then he says to the women, the older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands and to love their children, to again pass on that wisdom, that experience, that knowledge. Generationally, it's just amazing how much has been lost. Right? Because families used to be in the same neighborhoods. We're scattered all over the world in some cases now. And we lose some of that knowledge. Just the basic stuff. And then verse 6, he moves to the younger men, that they be sober-minded. Because young men are not typically known to be sober-minded, right? They're energetic. They don't oftentimes think down the road far enough to understand some of the implications. I know I didn't at a certain age. And so then he says, verse 7, in all things showing yourself to be a pattern of good works, that each of us should do this, right? We should be the sermon that's not preached, right? The example of how we live God's word. That showing yourself to be a pattern, he says, in doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility. Again, one of my side projects is studying church history since the first century. And it's amazing how oftentimes this bears out, that when God's people drift from this, it's usually within a generation or so, they're no longer part of the church of God. Because they've lost the right focus. They've compromised truth. They're not reverent to what God's instruction is and so forth. But then verse 8, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of you. It doesn't mean they won't say evil things about you, but it will have to be based on untruths, or it have to be these picayune things. Even bondservants, to be obedient to their masters. How do we behave even within our jobs? How we interact with our employer, if we're in an office job or wherever it is we work, whatever it is we're doing, to be well-pleasing in all things, not answering back, not to have a smart mouth or a sharp tongue, not pilfering, showing good fidelity, that they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior in all things, to be this example to the world. This all reflects in mentoring, is the point I have from this section. What do we teach others through our example and our word? How do we interact with them? So let's conclude then in 1 Peter 5, the end of Peter's first letter. In 1 Peter 5 and verse 5, he's talking about shepherding the flock earlier to the elders, and then he transitions here to this general submission that we're to all have. So he says, likewise, you younger, submit yourselves to your elders. He talked to the elders about not being harsh stewards, not acting as lords over them, to remember their responsibility to Jesus Christ. And so he says to them all, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another, clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Because you can work with someone who's humble. They're willing to entertain. They don't have everything figured out. They may not have all the answers. They're open to being directed or given further instruction, compared to, as I said earlier, somebody who's arrogant, who thinks they've got it all figured out. They know all the answers. You don't need to teach them anything. God resists that because that's a selfish approach. It's a closed approach. Relationships are important, more important than most give them credit to. In fact, to be emotionally healthy, we need meaningful, supportive, stable relationships. Success in life is nice, the clothes, the cars, the job, money, whatever it happens to be, but it means nothing if we sacrifice our relationship with God, with our spouse, with our family or friends. As Christ said, what does it gain us if we gain the whole world and we lose our soul? Right? In the end, it'll mean nothing. So let's remember to work on reflecting God in our relationships with Him, our spouse, our family, and our friends, so that all we say and do strengthens those relationships, because if we do, our example will preach the doctrine of God more than anything we could ever say.